Anyways, let's get started then. So for those of you who don't know me, hi, my name's Steven. I am a third-year software engineering major here. But let's get right into it. So, as you can see today, we'll be talking about adversarial thinking. If I use the abbreviation AT throughout the rest of this presentation, I am referring to that. Now, some of the contents we'll be going over is giving some kind of context and definition behind adversarial thinking, then putting it into context of cybersecurity, and then seeing how we can apply that to certain scenarios, maybe some questions of how we go about the adversarial thinking mindset, and then how we can maybe develop that mindset. But first off, quick disclaimer here. Please do not use anything you learned here for malicious intents. Thanks in advance on behalf of the CPSec team and probably the professors here. None of us really want to get into any legal trouble. Hopefully. Now, what exactly is adversarial thinking? And if you go right now on your phones, you look up adversarial thinking, you'll most likely get a pretty basic definition of thinking like a hacker, and because of social norms nowadays in movies and shows, you'll most likely get that kind of image of someone with a hoodie on, just a bunch of screens and displays and whatnot. And that doesn't necessarily give you the best idea of adversarial thinking. And so what exactly does thinking like a hacker mean? And some might say later that, wait, isn't this just critical thinking? Which is true in a sense. Now, expanding more on actual adversarial thinking, and materials are from Dr. Seth Hammond and Dr. Ken Hopkinson, associated with Cedarville University, from their adversarial thinking module in cooperation with the NSA. A better definition from that is adversarial thinking is the ability to embody the technological capabilities, the unconventional perspectives, and the strategic reasoning of hackers. That sounds a lot better than what we just had the previous slide. But then we still try to ask ourselves, well, what are in those thinking technical capabilities and those strategic reasonings? These are also same resources from the same material as described last time. We can describe better technological capabilities as understanding network protocols or just anything within the realm of the kind of academics and technology of security. So you'll be seeing a lot more of those low-level kind of resources and not as much. So for example, you see operating systems and programming languages and all kind of the different exploits and vulnerabilities from there. Next, unconventional perspectives. These are now that you've gone away from the more traditional attacks that you may see a hacker may use, such as buffer overflows, SQL injections, and such. These are more thinking outside of the box of what's actually, well documented out there. These are not from your top 10 list of exploits yet. These are more unconventional stuff that may be used in zero-day exploits and ones that aren't very picked up well by at least the blue team security community. And then one of the most important ones that links to actual hacker thinking is anticipating how hackers operate, and that may be when they may attack, how they attack, and then their tactics for evading detection, because it's safe to assume that hackers will succeed considering the amount of blue teams and actual security professionals out there who are working for making sure we don't get hacked versus the large amount of hackers out there. Now, to kind of step back a little bit of why exactly are we talking about this? Adversarial thinking is one of the defining characteristics of cybersecurity when you compare it against the rest of computer science. Not many other fields, human-computer interaction, artificial intelligence, you can list a whole bunch of our class names here. Adversarial thinking isn't really used in those unless you're kind of thinking about like some kind of enemy in those fields or some kind of hacker, which aren't too common. This adversarial thinking sets us apart where we're not just a field to define software engineering's best practices. We're actually a field where we have to think about how others might be trying to attack some of our computer systems. And we are also talking about this as considering the club's goals, Security Education Club, is we are trying to help develop some of you guys' mindset and abilities going into certain security classes and security career. And we can generalize it too in terms of, this isn't just applied to security. You can apply it to other works in life, just as for law, politics, war, if any of you get involved in that, any reason. And then just any careers in general where you may have to think critically from another perspective. And that may include customers when in software development and such, relevant to security education. And this isn't too common of a topic. From my time here, I don't think we've ever seen much talk of adversarial thinking, at least a whole talk dedicated on it. Maybe we've mentioned it in passing in some other talks. And I say that we don't talk about this a lot, rightly so, because it is an incredibly pretty abstract concept that isn't even well defined by the security education community. But here I am trying to give a talk on it. So now, before going into more of the actual adversarial thinking, there is some cognitive psychology background behind all of this. From Dr. Robert Sternberg's Sternberg's Triarctic theory of intelligence. Now, what we have here is that in a formal definition of it, you can see that starting from Dr. Sternberg's idea behind creating this theory, is that having measurable intelligence tests that test our vocabulary, our memory. I'm sure you've been through the ringer of some intelligence tests and aptitude tests out there. But having just those tests are a little narrow in terms of maybe putting an actual quantitative definition on intelligence. And so he tries to break it up into 3 other subdomains. And he does that through talking about the academic abilities of someone. So that just talks about our ability to comprehend a material from a technical background and as well as within a classroom environment. Then he talks about the creative side with, again, thinking outside the box and seeing how, linking it back to adversarial thinking, how might a hacker think around the box or outside the box in order to break into a system without using any of the commonly caught attacks and defenses. And then we have the contextual street smart. So now it's actual going into the practicality of things. And this goes into actual strategy and planning, and then the actual ability to execute out an attack and the practicality of it. Applying this into actual adversarial thinking, you can see that it correlates well with what I mentioned earlier from the technological capabilities, applying that into the analytical area. Then we have the unconventional perspectives, applying that into creative area. And then we have strategic reasoning, which goes into practical. Now, here are some useful questions within adversarial thinking you may want to ask yourself as you try to understand this mindset better and then seeing how you can use this for yourself within a security context or any context really where you may be having some actual stakes on the line here. So for example, starting with what is my organization most known for and what are most valuable assets? This is now thinking from the hacker's perspective of why they may be actually trying to attack us, linking back to the practicality of why they may taking the effort and time to attack your organization. And so this may vary. You may be some social media company and your data or your customer data is at most risk. Or you may be the US government, so your private and confidential data is most at risk. Bank data and such and such. Then the next question, how far will someone go to perform a successful attack and the likelihoods? And this links back to the first question of, if you're the US government and you're being targeted by a nation state, then they may go pretty far most likely to execute a successful attacks. Or if you're just kind of a startup, then you may not be as attacked by a nation state, but there may be other people out there trying to attack. And so that's when you start to try to calculate these likelihoods and then try to determine who's trying to get at you. And then from there, you can then delve further deep into some of the other questions. With that being said, what technical background might someone need to perform this exploit? If you're just trying to protect against simple brute force attacks for like a login page, that's not incredibly technical in terms of like the overall scope of all the attacks that go on out there. When you're comparing it against an actual maybe a buffer overflow or in the case of a few years ago, Stuxnet, if you're aware of that, that was a specifically crafted malware. Not going to say exactly which governments made it, but they targeted Iranian nuclear reactors. Anyways. After that, what are the most common attacks that may be attempted first? And again, these go after some like password attacks or SQL injections and all the cross-site scripting attacks. And those are the ones that may be the most easily to automate and as well as the most easily to perform by just anyone out there who may just have a resource to it. And so, for example, if you need to get something done really quick, you may be wanting to protect against those most common attacks first before you start going into, okay, how do I protect against malware or buffer overflows and such? Then the next one is more uncommon in terms of the questions you need to ask yourself. Have there been any major events recently that may prompt an attack or need some investigation? With recent events around the world, if you may have heard that there's tensions arising out there right now between United States and allies, and then with Ukraine against Russia. And so with those major events and those type of events in mind, some organizations, most in the context of that same scenario, some government organizations may need to consider, okay, do we need to reinforce certain parts of our security right now or our analysis or our kind of detections systems right now, as we start to figure out, okay, are they maybe be attacking us for any reason, or are tensions escalating even more? And such. Next one is, what do we have that's publicly documented and easily accessible? Say you have some kind of software artifact out there, and hackers may be going to that public resource first to then see, okay, so they have this, this, and this in here, so we can't do that. And then after that, they're going to be thinking, okay, let's think creatively outside the box of what can we do to then break your software artifact. Next is what are dependencies and third-party tools. This is a big one in the case of supply chain attacks, which have happened recently. If you've heard of the SolarWinds attack, other governments out there have managed to get into parts of our government systems by attacking first a smaller, less known organization out there, and then working their way through the dependencies and the third-party tools to get into a government system. And you may not really consider that at first because you're looking at right in front of you as, okay, this software is for my company and within my realm. But you're most likely using a lot of resources from other companies, and from there, they're going to be thinking creatively and practically into getting into your software and your systems through that route. And then the last one is a kind of a mitigation fail-safe you should always have, because most, if not all systems, are not fully protected. In the event of a successful attack, how would a hacker try to evade detection, and what will they do with that data? And so when you do assume that an attack will happen against your system, you can then create some mitigations against what will happen. So for example, if say someone does get in, you can at least say add some logging into your network architecture so that you can see that, okay, data has been taken out of my systems. And so from there, you can at least have some kind of mitigation or maybe a hunt at least to figure out what's going on and how we can recover from that incident. And some scenarios with our adversarial thinking applied. We have black box pen testing, which is a pretty obvious one. If you're working for a pen testing contract out there for another company, you may want to, of course, you'd be exhausting your suite of tests or suite of tools you may have to test against someone's company or network or such. But after that, you want to then think creatively as to how you can try to outsmart what they do already have, and then from there, they may be better equipped to break into a system. And another scenario is, say you've been assigned to this security team, and you have limited time to figure out what security issues you need to fix up first. And from there, you may apply adversarial thinking to figure out what do you prioritize. And that may be going through those gauntlet of questions to figure out what are your most vulnerable spots, what data is your company trying to protect, and what's most likely to be attacked first, and then what kind of threats are actually being out there, whether they be just your normal kind of script kiddie who's just trying to make a quick buck, or you're actually being targeted by a persistent threat from other governments. And another one that I particularly like to highlight is when you're working on a software architecture or a design from the very beginning. From currently, when within the realm of software engineering, security isn't well baked as much into the initial realms of, say, like a product requirement gathering, or simply just early on in the design stage, because people think, well, we need to get the product out in time so that my manager doesn't scream at me. And then security is that, oh, we'll get to it later, and then later is never. So ideally, what you would want to do is apply that adversarial thinking to the very start of, okay, so from the ground up, how do we build in these defense systems, and how do we teach our engineers to defensively program, so that later down the line we don't have to deal with so many security issues and patches and fixes. Now, what can you do to get a better grasp on this adversarial thinking mindset? Now, being aware of it is a great thing, and I hope you do learn about it from this talk. But the next best step is then approaching problems from an adversarial thinking perspective. And how might you do that now without being in an actual career and being out in the field where it does matter, is doing as many CTFs as you can and approaching them without doing a guide for them first. You want to approach the question or the say puzzle as pure as you can, and then try to exhaust what you know already. Maybe try to creatively think of it, and maybe you don't even have to necessarily try your creative thought, but you do want to compare that then later. If, say, you do some kind of a guide or a look at explanation for it, you can then compare your creative thinking with that guide, see what your gaps are in that knowledge, and then from there you would start to grow on that experience of having that adversarial mindset. And from there, you can also do bug bounties if you really are interested in trying to test against actual systems out there. And I've listed one last thing at the very last part, which is game theory. No, not the YouTube channel, but the actual field of game theory, where you're actively trying to think about other people's like objectives and strategies, and then see how you can maybe come up with a strategy for yourself, how you can actually apply math to it by doing all sorts of risk analysis, statistics to it. Though we don't often really talk about this in kind of the security context, but there are papers and some resources out there that are looking into how can we teach security students a better idea of how do we actually quantify and then teach it in a classroom environment. I'm sure some of you have gone through security classrooms and not really touch on the idea of adversarial thinking, which in and itself can be a good and bad thing. Because, for instance, since we can't really quantify adversarial thinking, most professors don't really just want to throw this idea at you and then say, all right, well, we talked about it, let's move on to the actual other parts of the class. There isn't really a strong way to teach this currently, but people are actively out there within the security education and the general computer science education area of saying, how do we, one, first quantify this, and they do that a little bit from the idea earlier of Sternberg's Triarctic theory of intelligence, and then two, can we create assignments and modules and baking that into an actual security curriculum. And some people are doing that through first teaching game theory in that context. But yeah, that's the end of the talk. These are some of the sources, if you're interested in any of them. Most of these are kind of from an academic background, so there's some of them are like a little bit long-winded papers. One is a really good PDF that is just kind of like a poster on it. If you are interested, feel free to ask, or you can talk to me about it. But yeah, that's the end of the presentation. I hope you guys have learned something about it. Yeah, thank you.